When a rejected auction horse is bought by a young man in a wheelchair, everyone mocks the animal and the disabled boy is bullied. But what happened next left everyone in shock when they discovered what the wheelchair user did to the bully. Before we dive in, if you, like us, are passionate about animals, subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any heartwarming stories. Thanks. Now, back to our story. The ballroom buzzed with the who's who of society on a warm Saturday afternoon. Crystal glasses clinked softly against champagne flutes as the local elite jostled for the best spots. The air was thick with the unmistakable scent of wealth and privilege, with ladies flaunting glittering jewels and gentlemen in impeccably tailored suits. It was the annual Stallion Springs Horse Auction, an event that had dictated social status in the region for generations. Ashley, the event coordinator, discreetly observed the flow while organizing the final registration forms. Her weary eyes caught an unusual commotion near the main entrance. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing a figure who was a stark contrast to the opulent setting. A young man in a manual wheelchair propelled himself with determination down the center aisle. His clothes, though clean and well cared for, were simple: a plaid shirt, jeans, and worn leather boots. The contrast with the attendees couldn't have been more striking. Whispers started almost instantly, like a swarm of angry bees. The murmur grew louder as Richard Sterling, the ranch owner's son, approached the newcomer with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Tall, tanned, and wearing a custom Italian suit, he was the epitome of the privilege that permeated the room. The young man in the wheelchair maintained his composure, his brown eyes fixed on the auction catalog he held firmly. "I came to participate in the auction, like everyone else," he replied with a calmness that seemed to irritate Richard even further. The first lot sparked heated bidding: gleaming thoroughbreds, prized mares, stallions of impeccable lineage. Each bid elicited sighs of admiration and restrained applause from the select audience. Then, something shifted in the atmosphere when lot number 17 was announced. A piebald gelding entered the ring, led by two visibly tense handlers. The animal, unlike the previous ones, didn't exhibit the expected majestic bearing. Its coat, though clean, revealed several scars, some still healing. Its posture was defensive, its ears turned back, betraying its discomfort. "What a joke," Richard interrupted, his voice echoing through the ballroom. "That nag shouldn't even be here. It's a stain on the reputation of our event." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard turned slowly, his eyes flashing with anger and disdain. Well, well, looks like we found the perfect match. A broken horse for a broken rider." The piebald gelding stood motionless in the center of the ring, his dark eyes fixed on the young man approaching in the wheelchair. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze in the auction hall, as if everyone present held their breath simultaneously. The young man ignored the looks of disdain and the whispers that followed him, focusing only on the animal before him. Richard Sterling let out a forced laugh, approaching with slow, calculated steps. "Ethan Carter, never heard of you. Where did this interesting character come from?" The last part was directed at the audience, who responded with muffled laughter. An elderly lady in the front row brought her hand to her lips, surprised by the direct response. Richard himself seemed momentarily disconcerted, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. As the handlers prepared to lead the animal away, Ethan moved even closer to the ring. The gelding, who until then had maintained a defensive posture with everyone who approached him, took a step in his direction, his ears now alert and curious. He was found abandoned 3 months ago, near the border of the Sterling Ranch. He was badly injured, probably the result of abuse. The handler hesitated before continuing. "We tried to rehabilitate him, but, well, some animals carry scars that run too deep." At this moment, Richard reappeared, now accompanied by his father, Robert Sterling, the ranch owner. The family patriarch observed Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Ethan finally turned his gaze from the horse, facing Robert directly. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate your concern, but you know what I see when I look at this animal. I don't see danger. I see fear. I see pain. And above all, I see potential." It was at that instant that something extraordinary happened. The gelding, who was still in the ring, let out a sharp whinny and lunged towards Richard, causing him to recoil in fright. However, as he passed Ethan, the animal slowed his pace, lowering his head slightly towards him. Ashley, who was watching everything from her post, couldn't help but smile. In her many years working at the Sterling auctions, she had never witnessed a scene like that. It was as if the horse, in some way, recognized in Ethan an equally wounded soul. Ethan slowly extended his hand, his fingers inches from the animal's muzzle. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, expecting the worst. But the gelding, defying all expectations, allowed the touch, closing his eyes for a brief moment. Ethan's small property was about 40 minutes from town. It was a modest but well-maintained place, with a renovated barn and a spacious fenced pasture. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set when the pickup truck transporting the gelding parked near the main gate. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper who had cared for the property for over 2 decades, approached slowly. Her grey hair was tied in a loose bun, and her calloused hands revealed a lifetime of hard work. "Good heavens, Ethan. When you said you'd bought a horse at the auction, I imagined something different." His words brought back memories that Mrs. Gable preferred to forget. The accident 5 years ago that had forever changed the life of the young man she had watched grow up. Ethan was only 22 years old when it happened. He was one of the most promising riders in the region, with several medals and trophies won in state competitions. On that fateful Sunday morning, during a routine practice, his horse was startled by a sudden noise and threw him. The fall was violent and the diagnosis devastating: spinal cord injury, permanent paraplegia. Ethan nodded, his eyes lost in reminiscence. "People change, Mrs. Gable. Pain teaches us, but it also transforms us. Today, I understand it wasn't the animal's fault." "What are you going to call him?" Mrs. Gable asked, noticing the silent connection between the two. Night was falling when Ethan began his routine with Phoenix. Patiently, he introduced him to the renovated barn, the trough with fresh water, the top-quality hay. The animal, though still wary, followed his movements with growing interest. At one point, while Ethan was adjusting the height of the trough, a sudden memory struck him. Richard Sterling, still a teenager, watching one of his performances. At the time, Ethan was the center of attention, the prodigy of equestrianism, while Richard was just another spectator in the stands. It was then that a noise coming from the entrance of the property caught his attention. Headlights cut through the darkness, and the engine of a luxury car roared menacingly. Ethan recognized the vehicle. It was the same one Richard drove at the auction. Richard Sterling's car parked abruptly in the yard of the property, kicking up a small cloud of dust. The door opened violently, and Richard and 2 men Ethan didn't recognize stepped out. Phoenix, sensing the tension in the air, began to stir in his new barn. "So this is where you live, Carter?" Richard advanced, his tone dripping with mockery. "I must admit it's more presentable than I imagined." For a moment, there was absolute silence on the property. Even the crickets seemed to pause in their nocturnal symphony. Ethan felt something change in the air. There was something in Richard's voice, a note of anxiety that didn't match his arrogant demeanor. What history would that be, Richard? It was then that Mrs. Gable, who was watching everything from the porch, decided to intervene. "Mr. Sterling," her firm voice cut through the night air, "I suggest you leave. Otherwise, I will be forced to call the police." After the car's headlights disappeared into the darkness of the country road, Mrs. Gable approached Ethan, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "There's something fishy about this whole thing, son. That night, as the property finally fell silent, Ethan remained awake in his room, his computer open, researching cases of missing horses in the area. On the screen, an old headline caught his eye. "Show Jumping Champion vanishes mysteriously after controversial win." His eyes quickly scanned the text and his heart quickened as he saw a black and white photo of a magnificent piebald gelding. Although the image was from 3 years ago, there was no doubt it was Phoenix in his glory days. And next to him, smiling at the camera, was a young equestrian that Ethan knew very well. Claire Sterling, Richard's younger sister, who had left the country abruptly after the animal's disappearance. The next morning dawned overcast, with a fine drizzle that transformed the pasture into a carpet of glistening dew. Ethan woke up early, his discoveries from the night before still echoing in his mind. Claire Sterling. That name brought back memories of a happier time, when racetracks and competitions were part of his daily life. Drinking his coffee on the porch, he watched Phoenix grazing peacefully. The animal was already showing subtle signs of adaptation. His posture was more relaxed, and occasionally he would approach the fence where Ethan was, as if seeking companionship. "She was always different from the other Sterlings." Mrs. Gable's voice came from behind him, carrying a tray with fresh bread and homemade jam. "Had a good heart, that girl." It was true. Claire had been his biggest rival, and paradoxically, his best friend on the equestrian circuit. While Richard had always shown disdain for competitors from more humble backgrounds, Claire saw beyond appearances and social positions. Mrs. Gable adjusted her reading glasses, studying the old photo. "I remember that day. It was her last big win. But there was something strange. Rumors about betting, about manipulated results." A sharp whinny interrupted the conversation. Phoenix had moved closer to the porch, his alert ears turned towards the dirt road leading to the property. Seconds later, the sound of an approaching car confirmed the reason for his restlessness. To the surprise of Ethan and Mrs. Gable, it wasn't Richard's sports car that appeared around the bend, but a yellow cab. From it stepped a figure that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. A young woman of about 30, her brown hair tied in a messy ponytail, simple clothes, and a worn travel backpack on her back. The young Sterling woman walked slowly towards the porch, her eyes fixed on Phoenix, who was now approaching the fence with visible agitation. Tears began to stream down her face. Claire finally averted her gaze from the horse and faced Ethan, her teary green eyes carrying the weight of 3 years of secrets. "Forgive me for not coming sooner, Ethan. But when I heard you'd bought him at the auction, I couldn't stay away. You need to know the truth. You need to know why I ran away, why Thunder disappeared, and—" She swallowed hard. "Why my brother will do anything to get him back." The kitchen of the house was immersed in a tense silence as Claire held a cup of tea between her trembling hands. Through the window, one could see Thunder, or Phoenix, as Ethan had renamed him, grazing peacefully under the drizzle that was still falling. Ethan adjusted his chair closer to the table, his eyes fixed on Claire. The young woman before him was very different from the confident equestrian he had known years ago. There was a fragility in her gaze, but also a quiet determination. Mrs. Gable, who was preparing more tea on the stove, let out a heavy sigh. "He wanted you to lose on purpose. Richard said that if I didn't cooperate, something could happen to Thunder. Accidents happen all the time in the stables," he said. Claire closed her eyes, reliving the painful memories. "One night, after refusing once again to participate in the scheme, I found Thunder very agitated in his stall. The vet discovered traces of a strange substance in his water trough. That's when I realized I needed to act," Claire continued. "With the help of a trusted groom, we planned everything. On a moonless night, we took Thunder out of the stable and took him to a distant farm. I knew I needed to disappear too. Richard would never forgive me." Claire's face twisted in an expression of pain. "The groom who helped me, he had an accident a few months later. I never knew if it was really an accident. I lost contact with the farm where Thunder was, and when I finally managed to locate the place, it had been sold. I've spent the last few years following false leads trying to find him. At this moment, a sharp whinny cut through the air. The three of them turned to the window where they saw Thunder standing alert, his ears pricked towards the entrance of the property. Claire stood up abruptly, the panic visible on her face. He must have found out I'm here. Ethan, you need to know one more thing. That last race, the one in the photo, it wasn't just manipulation of bets. There was something much worse, something that could destroy not only the Sterling family's reputation, but the entire credibility of the competition circuit. The sound of the car was getting closer and closer. Ethan could see the headlights reflecting in the rain through the kitchen window. "Party's over," he said, his voice laden with threat. And then, to everyone's horror, he pulled a gun from his coat pocket. "Put down that gun, Richard," Claire's voice trembled, but she maintained firmness. "You've already caused enough damage." "This isn't the solution, Richard," Ethan said, his serene voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "What happened in that last race? What was so bad that you need to hide it so desperately?" "You don't understand," he murmured, the hand holding the gun trembling slightly. "Nobody was supposed to get hurt. It was just supposed to be another rigged race." Mrs. Gable's face paled at the revelation, and Ethan felt his heart tighten. Now everything made sense. Richard's obsession with recovering Thunder, the desperation in keeping Claire away. At this moment, a powerful whinny cut through the air. Thunder had approached the kitchen window, his intelligent eyes fixed on the scene unfolding inside the house. The sound seemed to awaken something in Richard, who for a moment lowered the gun slightly. It was all Ethan needed. With years of experience maneuvering his chair, he moved forward quickly, using the element of surprise to his advantage. His abrupt movement caught Richard off guard, causing him to lose his balance on the wet kitchen floor. "It's over, Richard," Claire said, kicking the gun away from her brother's reach. "I won't let you hurt anyone anymore." It was then that something extraordinary happened. Thunder, who until then had kept his distance, galloped towards Richard. The animal that everyone judged to be traumatized and broken showed his true nature, not of a victim, but of a protector. The sound of police sirens cut through the early morning air, mixing with the drumming of the rain that was now falling less intensely. Thunder remained like a living statue between Richard and the barn, his ears alert to every movement. The moment of tension had passed, but the air was still charged with the weight of the recent revelations. "I never thought I'd live to see this," murmured Mrs. Gable, watching the scene through the kitchen window. The horse everyone called dangerous, protecting his new home. Ethan smiled softly, his eyes fixed on Thunder. "Because I recognized the look in his eyes, Claire. It wasn't anger he carried, it was hurt. The same hurt I carried after my accident." As the officers led Richard away, Claire approached her brother. Her green eyes, once full of fear, now showed a mixture of sadness and determination. "I'm so sorry, Claire," he murmured so low that only she could hear. I lost control." The next hours were intense. Statements were taken, documents were presented, and the truth about that last race finally came to light. Claire revealed all the details about the betting scheme and Richard's criminal actions. "What are you going to do now?" Ethan asked Claire, as they watched Thunder grazing peacefully, as if the dramatic events of the night had never happened. "Actually," she hesitated for a moment, "I was thinking of something different, something that could help other people, other horses." Her eyes sparkled with an idea that was beginning to take shape. "Ethan, what if we turned this place into an equine therapy center?" The sun was already high when Dr. Miller, the local veterinarian, arrived at the property to examine Thunder. Ethan and Claire watched attentively as the professional performed a complete assessment of the animal. Claire let out a sigh of relief. After the events of the night before, it was comforting to have a professional confirmation that Thunder was really okay. Dr. Miller smiled, adjusting his glasses. "With the temperament he's shown, I'd say he's perfect. Horses that have gone through trauma and recovered often develop a special sensitivity with people who also face challenges. The morning passed in planning and discussions. Claire, who had kept in touch with various professionals during her years abroad, already had a network of contacts that could help turn the dream into reality. Ethan watched the drawings with growing interest. "We could use that land in the back to build more stalls," he suggested, pointing to the property map, "and turn the old shed into a covered area for rainy days." Claire tensed visibly, but remained firm. Ethan positioned his chair discreetly beside her in a silent gesture of support. "I came to ask for forgiveness," Robert continued, tears now running freely down his face. "To you, Claire, for not realizing what was happening under my own roof. To you, Ethan, for all the prejudice and arrogance that our family has shown." It was then that Ethan had an idea. "Mr. Sterling," he called, advancing with his chair, "do you know anything about equine therapy centers?" A glimmer of interest appeared in Robert's tired eyes. "I always thought it would be an excellent initiative, but why?" In the weeks that followed, Ethan's property transformed into a construction site. The proposed partnership with Robert Sterling had proven more promising than anyone could have imagined. The family patriarch not only embraced the idea of the equine therapy center, but also made resources and contacts available to make the project a reality. "I never thought I'd see the day when the Sterlings and the Carters would work together," commented Mrs. Gable, watching the workers install an access ramp near the main barn. Claire, who was supervising the renovation of one of the stalls, approached with Thunder by her side. The gelding, now fully recovered, followed every change on the property with evident curiosity. Ethan watched the animal with pride. Thunder had transformed in recent weeks. His coat shone with health, and his scars, though still visible, seemed less pronounced. But the biggest change was in his eyes. The fear had given way to a serene confidence. Claire sat down on a nearby bale of hay, her expression thoughtful. "Dad mentioned that some of his old contacts in the equestrian circuit have shown interest in learning about the project. Apparently, the idea of transforming a traditional ranch into a therapeutic center has caught the eye of the community." Robert Sterling parked his car and walked towards them, carrying a folder of documents. His visits had become frequent, and increasingly he showed genuine enthusiasm for the project. The news was received with smiles and hugs. It was another important step in realizing the dream that had been born on a stormy night. "He's different," Robert said, running a hand through his grey hair. "The letter, he asks for forgiveness, says that his time in prison has made him reflect on his choices, on the harm he caused, and—" He hesitated for a moment. "He asked if, when he serves his sentence, he could work on the project caring for the horses." It was then that Thunder, who until then had been watching everything from a distance, approached Robert. The gelding, who had once been a victim of Richard's actions, gently rested his muzzle on the older man's shoulder as if offering comfort. The morning of the first official day of the Sterling Carter Equine Therapy Center dawned clear and crisp. Ethan woke up before sunrise, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation making his heart beat faster. From the window of his room, he could see the first golden rays illuminating the new facilities. The center had turned out even more beautiful than they had imagined. The renovated stalls shone with new paint, the access ramps were wide and safe, and an elegant sign at the entrance announced, "Where limitations transform into possibilities." Ethan smiled, remembering the moment he saw Thunder for the first time. Life has a funny way of putting the pieces together, doesn't it? "The volunteers are already arriving," she informed, consulting her clipboard. "The technical team is also on their way. Physical therapist, occupational therapist, psychologist." As if understanding that he was being mentioned, the gelding raised his head, his ears alert. In recent months, he had shown himself exceptionally receptive to training for equine therapy, developing a special sensitivity with people. The photo perfectly captured the essence of what the center had become. The belief that everyone deserves a second chance, that limitations do not define who we are. "Welcome to the Sterling Carter Equine Therapy Center," Ethan introduced himself, moving his chair closer to the family. "We are very happy to receive you." At this moment, Thunder, as if understanding his role, approached calmly. To everyone's surprise, the gelding who was once considered dangerous lowered his majestic head to the height of Peter's chair, allowing the boy to touch him. The smile that illuminated Peter's face at that moment was like a ray of sunshine after a long storm. It was the same smile that Ethan had discovered in himself when he found Thunder, the same that Claire rediscovered when she returned home, the same that now shone in the eyes of all present. It was then that Ethan realized something extraordinary. The true therapy was not only in the exercises they would perform, in the techniques they would apply. It was there, in that moment of pure connection, in that ability to see beyond limitations and scars. 6 months had passed since the inauguration of the Sterling Carter Equine Therapy Center. Autumn painted the trees with golden and reddish hues, and a cool breeze blew through the fields. The center had become a success beyond expectations. The waiting list grew every week, and the results of the first patients were impressive. Peter, the first patient, was already able to sit up much more firmly, and his motor development surprised even the most skeptical doctors. Other patients also showed remarkable progress, not only physically, but also in emotional and social aspects. On that particular morning, however, there was a different tension in the air. Ethan watched through the window of his office as an unfamiliar car approached along the dirt road. His heart quickened as he recognized the driver. It was the Sterling family's lawyer. "Yes," Claire interrupted softly, "he still wants to work here. Said he's willing to start from scratch, doing any job we offer." "What do you think?" Ethan asked Thunder, who was grazing peacefully near the window of his office. The gelding raised his head, his wise eyes meeting Ethan's. A week later, the same car from the lawyer returned to the property. This time, however, it carried an additional passenger. Richard Sterling got out of the vehicle slowly, almost hesitant. He was thinner, his face paler, and his eyes had lost that characteristic arrogance. "Welcome back," she said, her voice choked with emotion. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Thunder, who was in the nearby pasture, began to approach slowly. Everyone held their breath, remembering the last time the horse and Richard had been face to face. Time seemed to have frozen in that moment. The gentle autumn breeze stirred Thunder's mane as he and Richard stared at each other. The silence was so deep that you could hear the rustling of dry leaves on the ground. Thunder took a step forward, then another. Ethan, Claire, and the others watched, holding their breath. The gelding was now only an arm's length away from Richard. With surprising gentleness, the animal extended his neck and lightly touched the man's shoulder with his muzzle. "If Thunder can forgive," said Ethan, approaching in his chair, "who are we not to do the same?" One afternoon, while Ethan was supervising a therapy session with Peter, he noticed something interesting. Richard was in the corner of the paddock, watching attentively how the therapists and volunteers worked with the children. "I believe your experiences can be valuable here," Ethan replied. "You know the darker side of the equestrian world, but you also know the power of transformation that these animals have." One particularly special morning, Claire found her brother in the barn, carefully brushing Thunder's coat. The animal, who had previously been startled by his presence, now relaxed visibly under his care. Richard nodded, his hands never stopping the rhythmic movement of the brush. "I lost my way, Claire. I got so lost that I almost destroyed everything and everyone around me. But here," he paused, looking around the renovated stable, "here I found something I never had in all those victories and bets." In the paddock, Ethan was conducting another session with Peter. The boy, who could barely sit alone 6 months before, now smiled radiantly as Thunder carried him gently, guided by a dedicated team. A year had passed since the inauguration of the Sterling Carter Equine Therapy Center. The spring sun bathed the property as the guests arrived for the center's first anniversary celebration. Colorful banners decorated the gates, and the aroma of coffee and Mrs. Gable's goodies filled the air. Ethan, in his wheelchair impeccably cleaned for the occasion, watched the activity with pride. The center had grown beyond his most optimistic expectations. They now served more than 50 patients regularly, and their waiting list continued to grow. "Nervous?" Richard asked, carefully adjusting Peter's helmet. Blair, who was coordinating the event, called everyone's attention with a microphone. "Welcome to our one-year celebration. Before the special presentation, I would like to share some news." She paused, smiling at the audience that included family members of patients, professionals in the field, and local authorities. The Sterling Carter Equine Therapy Center has been selected as a model of excellence by the National Equine Therapy Council. Starting next month, we will be a training center for professionals from across the country. Enthusiastic applause echoed throughout the grounds. Ethan sought out Mrs. Gable's gaze in the crowd, finding the kind woman with her inevitable handkerchief dabbing away tears of joy. Robert Sterling, standing next to Richard, smiled proudly. His son, now trained as an equine therapy assistant, had become a fundamental part of the center, especially in working with more challenging cases. Ethan felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Claire. "We did it," she whispered. "We achieved something much bigger than we dreamed." The afternoon sun cast a golden light over the paddock, making Thunder's scars seem only like marks from a story of overcoming. Ethan realized that the same could be said about all of them. Their scars, visible or not, had transformed into silent witnesses of their journeys of healing and transformation. Claire smiled, her eyes shining with restrained tears. "It wasn't just a decision, Ethan. It was courage. Courage to see beyond appearances, to believe in the capacity for change, to give a second chance." In the center of the paddock, Peter concluded his presentation under warm applause. Thunder, majestic and serene, seemed to smile in his equine way. And Ethan, watching everything from his wheelchair, understood that some limitations exist only in the eyes of those who don't know how to see beyond them. The Sterling Carter Equine Therapy Center had become more than just a place of therapy. It was a living testament that true healing begins when we learn to forgive, to start over, and above all, to believe in the transformative power of love and understanding.